Thank you very much, Kitsa. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I know, conferences can feel long sometimes, right? By the time you get to the last session, but I think we've saved something really special for this last session. This is something unique that fits together with one of the central themes of this exhibition, which is to investigate Dixon as a poet and to ask some questions about how we can maybe understand a little bit more about his painting by reading his poetry. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation down here. I'll talk a little bit about some of my interest in his poetry and how that influenced the exhibition. And then we'll go upstairs, as Kitsa mentioned, and have an opportunity to hear from some student presenters. These are students who have written poetry in response to Dixon paintings. And we had a wonderful event a little while ago where they presented these poems here in the museum, and so it's a really wonderful opportunity to share with you not only how and why Dixon's poetry is significant, but to show how that can continue to inspire some cross-disciplinary artistic expression. So it's really, I think, a wonderful event to close out our session today. So, of course, the title of this exhibition is Maynard Dixon Searching for a Home Painted in Poetic Imagination in the American West. And I think throughout our sessions yesterday and today, we've probably all gotten a little bit of a sense for why the main title is Maynard Dixon Searching for a Home. So much having to do with the fact that he was looking for a place to belong. He was looking for a place that resonated with him when he went on these trips into the western deserts that we've talked about. But the subtitle here, Painted in Poetic Imagination in the American West, was something that became more and more important to me as I started to immerse myself in the Maynard Dixon research. Exhibitions take a long time to put together. And this particular show I worked on for about 6 years. This wasn't my one project for 6 years. I had a lot of things going on. But that, just to give you a sense for this is how long I personally have been ruminating on some of the ideas that we see in this exhibition. And so, just to give you an idea of how the poetry influenced the way I started to see Maynard Dixon's work, I want to start with this wonderful painting, Maces in Shadow. When we go up to the gallery, and those of you who've already been to the gallery, which I would imagine is most of you, this is the first painting that you see when you enter in through that beautiful, incredible entryway that our designers built for us. But this is the first painting you see when you walk in, and part of the reason it's the first painting in the exhibition is because it's my favorite Maynard Dixon painting. And so, curator's choice, right? As the curator, I get to make certain decisions, and so this was one of the first paintings I wanted to see when we walked into the space. And whenever I lead groups through, whenever I give a tour in the gallery space, we'll pause here to talk about Dixon's technique. Because one of the things that I think happens is that people fall in love with Dixon's images as a kind of evocative reference to the Western landscape, but sometimes they're paying so much attention to the subjects, the locations, that they're not looking at the actual painting. They're not necessarily looking at the brush strokes, looking at the way he uses color. And so I'll pause here and show people, as you're walking through this gallery, really pay attention to the way he's using the paint. You can really see this kind of lusciousness, this tactility in his painting. But I love his use of color. I love his use of these open geometric shapes that we see here. As has been discussed, that there's sometimes in Dixon a way of seeing him as a kind of daring modernist in some of his landscapes in some ways because of his interest in geometry. And so this is the type of painting from Dixon that I truly, truly love. But as I was spending time looking at these paintings and immersing myself in the research, I then also started reading Dixon's poetry. I did not discover his poetry. Other people certainly have talked about his poetry. It's a known fact that he wrote poetry. But I started to read through his poems while I was preparing this exhibition and while I was looking at these paintings. And I started to sort of ask myself, what new perspectives can I experience looking at these paintings through his poetry? And so, for example, I came across this poem, World's End. I am a city's one unwilling guest, with 3 good friends, a dog, a horse, a gun. Would I might wander where the great southwest lies throbbing with pulses of the sun, and waiting silent with her warm brown breast turned up to him, where gray time for a span has dropped the seasons, she awaits the best soul-singing thought of some great silent man. So I was reading this poem and really being struck by just the emotional intensity of a poem like this. the way he's describing in very sensual language, describing the Southwest waiting for him and beckoning him, right? She awaits the best soul-singing thought of some great silent man. And so looking at a painting like this, I started to imagine Dixon imagining himself as this great silent man, and that the Southwestern desert was waiting, inviting him to have this communion, this experience in the Southwest. And I started to realize that these paintings, I think, do have a very emotional component. And that deeply emotional component, to some extent, may be available to us, or may be made available to us as we read his poetry. Because he does sometimes use similar images, similar subject matter in the poems and in the paintings. But in the poems, he also is telling us how he feels about it. So instead of just looking at the painting, we also have a little bit of an insight into the artist's mind. But there was something else about the poetry that struck me. Look at the date. 1896. Now, again, we've been talking about Dixon for a couple days now. And those of you who know a little bit about his career know that 1896, that's really before he spent any time in the Southwest for any extended period of time. I mean, he was born in California. Grew up in California, so he's certainly around kind of the cowboy ranching culture of California. But when we talk about sort of what he saw as these kind of unspoiled locations in the American Southwest, he's taken little trips and things, but it's really not until about the turn of the century. It's about 1900 and then 1905 more particularly, where he goes out and starts to spend long periods of time in these locations. And so I started to realize he was writing poetry like this, talking about how the great Southwest was waiting for him before he had ever gone there to experience it. So it was almost like through this poetry, he was convincing himself of this sort of transcendent experience. He was convincing himself before he ever had the experiences firsthand that he was going to find a transformative reality in the Southwest. And I was so compelled by that idea, the idea that when we look at paintings like this, and again, this is, quite a bit later from that poem, this is a man who had, even before he engaged with the Southwest in a really profound way, was emotionally preparing himself to find transformation in that space. So we look at a painting like this, High in the Morning from 1933. This is also near the front of the exhibition. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous view. I love the subtlety of his atmospheric perspective here, right? We really get a sense of the distance of those mountains in the background, even though they're so large in the composition, even though the sort of geometries of this space are so intense. We're definitely aware of this gap between us where we are and the mountains on the other side. And looking at a beautiful painting like this, contemplating his engagement in the space on a purely aesthetic level, but then also thinking about another poem. And again, this is 1904, so we're talking years before, right? Almost 30 years before he's painting this particular painting. So I'm not saying a one-for-one connection between this painting and this poem, just saying if we engage with the ideas of the poetry as we look at the paintings. So here we have Homelands from 1904, and this is just a section of the poem. It says, "The mighty West looms vast before my sight, bright in the mystery of sun and sky. Mesa and plain, the desert and the sun, the scar-faced mountains and the blinding snows, the deathless blue and soaring angel clouds, and on its farthest rim I see my soul arise, broad-winged and free, and beckon me." So I imagine Dixon painting in a location like this, knowing that there are at least times when he looks at a Western landscape, looks at a Western expanse, and sees it as a place of personal apotheosis and transformation. That he can stand there and imagine his soul arising into the sky like a broad-winged bird, and then of course we all know he then adopts the thunderbird as his personal symbol. And so this idea that he is imagining these landscapes before he ever gets there, or before he's spending long periods of time there, he's imagining these landscapes as the kind of place where he will feel his very soul ascending into the heavens. So, as we engage in these different phases of Dixon's career, these different genres that he participated in, many of which we've talked about throughout this conference, we can also find poetry that relates to those different sections of his career. And like I said, it's not, for me, an interest in saying, here's this one poem and this one painting, and I see a direct connection between them. It's more about, kind of themes and ideas, and how I see these ideas he's working through these ideas in his poetry, and then we see similar ideas appearing in the paintings. But we spent a whole session yesterday talking about Dixon's engagement with the various native peoples that he interacted with. And we've talked about his extended stay at the Taos Pueblo, for example. And so when he creates some of these images that we see of some of the sacred ceremonies of various peoples that he spends time with, he was invited to participate in these things. Some of these things he did see firsthand and was honored to do that. And I think he had truly great, profound appreciation and authentic love for these various native peoples that he interacted with. They were his friends. He lived among them. He spent long periods of time among them. But at the same time, when he paints them, as we've talked about, he's also open about the fact that his imagination is free to do what it does. So he never claims that his paintings are meant to be documentary. He is clear about the fact that, yes, I love these people, I respect these people, but if you went and visited them, you may not see what I painted. So he's very open about that fact. And so I've long been fascinated about, how do we hold these two things at the same time with Dixon? How do we hold together this idea of, a loving, authentic expression of these people that he knew and lived among and saw their lives, but then also allowing his own imagination to do what it does. Another example, this wonderful painting of Christmas Eve procession in Taos, and showing us this, these life ways, the ways that these people have been living for hundreds of years, thousands of years in some locations. But then Dixon saying things like, I believe that only the artist can freely experience and interpret these events. He claims having a certain special authorship sometimes in how these types of things are being represented. Well, so I find this poem interpreter, and I think in this poem interpreter, it's another example of him working through these ideas, and whether or not he feels like he gets to be the I in this statement of what it means to be a Native person, even though he is not a Native person. So he writes, I am the one who brings from the records of rocks, from the cliffs where they dwell, the authentic feathers of direction, from the red crumbled earth of my bed, the undoubtable dust of dreams. Out of the dust of dreams long held and true to my waking, I, who hold the black bowl of visions, come with the answer of thunder-topped mesas and revelation of star-traveled plains. He writes a number of paintings, or writes a number of poems about Native peoples that are from the position of a Native subject. That, he talks about being a shaman. Says, I am the one who brings this forth. And so I think that shows us some of that complicated personal narrative that's going on with him when he's painting things like this. That he does, at least from a creative perspective, feel like he has the right to speak from a position of I. Feels like he does have a right to express a certain lived reality of these lifeways that he's not actually part of. And I think that is, a kind of complication in his work. And I think it's important, from my perspective, to not say that means that his depictions of Native peoples are not, worthy of consideration or should be, not discussed. I just think it's important to have that conversation and to ask these questions and to continually ask, where do we see the role of subjectivity and agency in these paintings? Who do we think has the right to present certain stories and to interpret those stories? So I think it's important to have those kinds of conversations with Dixon. Of course, we've also talked about his wonderful social realist paintings. We had an incredible talk from John Ott last night at dinner talking about the Boulder Dam paintings. I talked a little bit about Forgotten Man yesterday. These are some of my favorite paintings in Dixon's career. And I love how different they are from so much else. I love the landscapes. I love the portraits of pioneer families in the West. I love everything. But there is something about these social realist paintings that does speak to me. And I think part of it has to do with this raw quality that I talked about a little bit yesterday, that I think Dixon was in a place when he painted these, that he was feeling very pessimistic about the world, and that he was seeing a real sense of futility in the things that people were trying to do to deal with and overcome the Depression. I mean, we look at a painting like this that I mentioned yesterday, No Place to Go, where we have essentially one of these figures, like the figures he and Dorothea Lange had seen walking on the street, looking for a new opportunity, looking for work, looking for some way out of the poverty that they are experiencing in the Depression. And here he imagines one who has walked essentially all the way to the ocean, and pauses now as he sees his first view of the ocean and realizes, well, I can't walk any further. I've walked all the way to the ocean and I still haven't found an answer. Well, not surprisingly, we also find poetry that Dixon writes that is dealing with the intense emotional experiences of the Great Depression. And this is a pretty bleak poem he writes that's called 1934. Horrible to wake up in the night and feel time pressing slowly, the silent hours sliding through the dark as the dumb world turns, slowly pressing the dim down inexorably against defenseless window panes, to feel the deep earth shudder, its unimaginable agony slowly being forced asunder, to feel the perfect buildings of our pride, clean cut and small tilted off balance, reel towards darkness, and in the torn gap, myriads of people, puny and helpless, struggling like maggots in a wound, and clear above a pitiless cold blade of cosmic light. Oh, horrible. Right? I know, right? Sometimes it's like you feel sometimes with Dixon's poetry, and I don't want to sound flippant because I think he was in true personal pain at this time period. You look at his life in 1934 and 1935, economic difficulties, his marriage collapsing. I think he felt every word that he writes here, but sometimes it does feel a little bit like teaching a high school creative writing class. It's kind of like a little on the nose. Let's pull it back a little bit. But we get a sense of this personal pain that he's having. So when we look at paintings like No Place to Go or like Forgotten Man, it helps us to read the poetry and to understand more of his individual suffering and individual pain, and know that he is painting these at the same time that he is truly seeing the world around him as just a dark and futile experience. Another phase of his career that was talked a little bit about today that I truly love is he does all these incredible paintings of people's houses. I was talking a little bit about it today. These really beautiful, and I call them house portraits because that's kind of how they feel. These really loving representations of houses. And some of them are houses of people that he knew, that he interacted with. He also paints lots of different kinds of houses. So we see houses of ranchers in southern Utah. We see houses of Flathead Indians in this case. Different types of houses. Here's Old Home Site for 1937, which is really wonderful. That beautiful tree in the foreground, right? Where it is not just the house itself, but it is, the entire home site that he's representing. And there are a few things going on with the home portraits. One of them has to do with the main title of the exhibition, Searching for a Home. And so here we have two Dixon houses, right? We have Mount Carmel and Tucson, the two houses that he had near the end of his life. When Dixon was getting ready to leave San Francisco with his third wife, Edith Hamlin, he was telling friends about all of these different projects that he wanted to work on when they left San Francisco. And one of the things he told friends, he says, I want to write an autobiography. And then he would jokingly say, I'm going to call it Other Men's Houses. And the reason he would say that is because even though he was at that point near the end of his life, the last years of his life, he had never owned his own home. And so he felt like, I've spent my whole life in other people's houses. And so I think when we look at these portraits of houses, I think there's a little bit of a kind of envy thing going on, not just the idea of home ownership, but the idea that these are people who found a place to be, and that's something that he wanted so much. But then I also found this poem, Sanctuary, written in 1935. This is another bleak poem, and you can imagine why, 1935, the year that he and Dorothea Lange divorced. And this is a section of the poem, it's not the whole poem, but this is actually a poem in which he's thinking about death, and he's thinking about potentially dying in the desert and finding sort of a final place to die in the desert. So in this last section he says, Here I remain, come on then you hovering buzzards from your wide and pitiless circles, and slowly descending glide. Only a little while yet and you will find me, your dark and darkness confirming wings to me shall be welcome. Come on, wheeling buzzards, make a clean job. Tear the old garments, these of my life, tear them away, Pick the bones clean, let them lie free to the rain and the white, cleansing sun. And now this is the part that jumped out at me. Leave only my thoughts. These thoughts that once made me a man surely will find their way back to the home corral in the quiet evening. So in this poem where he's writing about his own death, he imagines the only form of an afterlife that he imagines is maybe my thoughts, the only things that will be left after my body is gone and cleansed by the desert sun. Maybe my thoughts will be like an old horse and can finally find their way to the old homestead. So I started to see these house portraits not only as his desire for a place to belong, but seeing that desire for a place to belong in almost a transcendent spiritual sense, that he imagines the Western homestead as heaven. So when we look at Dixon, and look at this incredible photograph of Dixon, we see a complicated man, and hopefully that's the story we've gotten through this entire symposium. We see a man with a complicated life, with highs and lows, with bouts of depression that he fought through, fighting, physical ailments near the end of his life, which were great complications in his working career. All of these complications throughout his life, and we can never know for sure what's inside. We can never know 100% what a person is thinking. And at the same time, it's also important what we're thinking, not just to wonder about what the artist is thinking when we engage with these objects. But I hope that as we look at Dixon's poetry, we do find another avenue into understanding a little bit about what these paintings could have meant to him, how these paintings participated in his own psychological and emotional engagement as he tried to understand the complexities of his own life.